All right, we'll be continuing the conversation about games and contemporary culture. What an amazing keynote. Thank you so much, John. What an amazing little intermezzo about Power Wash Simulator. I've played my fair share, so I think we've made an excellent start here. I am joined by some amazing speakers here on stage. So obviously you've just met John, who's done an amazing keynote, but we've also got Emily Sexton on the end, who's ACMI's very own Director of Curatorial Programming and Education. And we've got Hugh Davies here joining us as well, researcher, artist, educator, and president of the Chinese Digital Games Research Association.
Well done.
Quite a long title, yeah. So I might jump to all of you in a moment for a brief introduction to talk a little bit about games and what you do in that context. But before I do that, I just wanted to give a heads up to the audience to let you know that we do have a mechanism in place for you to submit your questions. So there's a QR code up there. If you're listening to the discussion unfold, please don't be shy. If you have any questions, submit them. We'll get to them at the very end of the session, and I think we have about 15 minutes for questions. So if anyone has any questions and you want to direct them to a specific person, if you could include a note to that effect, that would be super, super helpful. So yes, happy to jump to introductions. I might start off with Hugh. I know you have some images to share, if you're ready to jump in, and we'll see if we can get them up on the screen.
Yep. So the first image is, this is a conference I held in Shanghai last year as president of the Chinese Digital Games Research Association. When I say, I mean, I held it, it was very much sort of an organizational event, but it was the first conference on video games that I've done in China. I think this is the third one I've done in a row. The previous one was in Hong Kong, and the year before that was in Nanjing. But this one was in Shanghai, and this one really was just about video games in museums. And if you scan the QR code, it should take you to the program. I believe it does still. And it was a fantastic event just in terms of really kind of marrying a lot of these concerns around video games in museums in a very kind of like Chinese context, I suppose, with a very sort of different set of concerns and values around video games. So, but yeah, as president of this organization, that's essentially what I'm doing at the moment. The Video Games in Museum event took place across two locations. One of them was the Cadpa Video Game Museum in Shanghai. And it was an enormous exhibition of a whole lot of consoles and computers and games and one thing and another. But this one really stuck out to me, which was a console which was made sometime in either the 1970s or the 1980s. The curators of the museum don't really know. There's been some sort of reverse engineering of the console to try and work out its age by sort of, dating the capacitors and the resistors within the motherboard and so on. But I guess it really highlights for me the concerns of researching video games in China, which is that there is so much that needs to be done. There is so much heavy work that needs to be done. There are many consoles, there are many computers and stuff where the history is not known. It's forgotten. We don't know if this was mass-produced or individually produced, or so yeah, all of these histories are yet to be sort of like fully explored. This is another exhibition from the Cadpa Museum. And this really sort of sets the scene. This is a Chinese lounge room from about 1992, 1993, where you really have sort of, the pride and joy of all of the future technologies in the lounge room, from the TV, the air conditioning fan, and the new computer game, which is quite a contested object. This is the Subo, or Little Tyrant computer game, and it's a keyboard, and it's passing itself off as a computer to the parents and the grandparents of the children who buy it, who fully recognise it's a video game. So there's a contested history around video games at that time, this where video games were making their way into lounge rooms, where the people who made them fully recognised what they were doing, where the children fully recognised what it was. And I guess that sensitivity around video games still exists in China today. This is just one of the panels. This wasn't actually at the museum. This is at the New York University of Shanghai, who was also a partner in the event. And I really just have a sort of very small set of slides. There's so many images that I could show of video game museums in China. There's now a new renaissance of museums opening in China between, I think, it slowed down during the pandemic. There was sort of one museum opening a day during the pandemic, which was actually a slowdown from what it had been prior to that. And now we're seeing again a whole lot more museums opening in China, and video games museums are among them. So this is a video game museum in Guangzhou, run by a friend of mine, San Lung, and it's one of the video game museums in China, which is really just sort of independently established and run by a video game fan, and who's collected a whole lot of his own objects and objects of other people, and put them in this museum. I visited the museum in 2023. We don't share a language, San Lung and I. We communicate mostly through WeChat and and WeChat Translate. But he was generous enough to say to me via WeChat, look, I don't speak English well enough to communicate this, and I recognise that you don't speak Cantonese or Mandarin, but I'm just going to give you the tour. So he toured me through the whole museum and then took me back into his archive, where he's got all of this self-funded air conditioning cabinets, which show all of these incredibly deep histories of video game museums, all self-funded, going back to sort of like the 1970s and the 1980s. And we don't share a language, but there is such a common language there in sort of recognition of the objects and their gravitas, I suppose, their value within this context of video games. And I think this is the last slide that I have. And it's really one of many Famiclones. So people might be aware of the Famicom. You mentioned Japanese video game history. Japan really, I mean, there's really sort of three great video game empires. If you begin with sort of, America and the Atari 2600 in the 1970s and into the 80s. And then what's called the Great Video Game Crash happens in 1984, 85, when everyone is like catastrophically disappointed with how bad the E.T. video game is, and it completely destroys the video game market. They bury shipping containers of the game in the Arizona desert because it's so bad. People probably know this history, and at that point, Japan realizes there's a gap in the market, and they come out with Famicom, the Japanese family computer. But they realize it doesn't fit in the American lounge room. It's designed for a tatami mat Japanese lounge room, and they sort of retrofit it to make it look like a video recorder. And that's the Nintendo Entertainment System, the NES. And what happened around that time was everyone was buying, prior to that Atari 2600, suddenly everyone's buying NES consoles. China wasn't able to afford any of these. So what happened in China at that time was in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, and in mainland China. I'm being very expansive when I say China, because that's sort of three distinct areas of China at that time. Everyone started making shanzhai or emulation consoles, so which are kind of like sort of seen in the West and elsewhere as sort of like a bit of a joke, these Chinese cheap versions. But it's very important to realize that these were the games, not just this one, but Famiclone consoles really are millions of people's first contact with video games. So literally from like Jakarta to Istanbul, Moscow to Cape Town, so many people's first experience of video game is through the sort of this leveling out, this fact that people are able to buy one for so cheap. And that's why, for me, Chinese video game histories and futures are so important, because, of course, the third great empire of video games is now China, which is the biggest consumer and producer of video games. So that's sort of a bit of context about me and my research, and yeah.
Thanks so much, Hugh.
Thanks, Hugh. I was really privileged to attend the conference that Hugh led in Shanghai last year, and it was 4 incredible days of just feeling grateful to be included as Australians, and I really applaud the work that Hugh has done over many years to be present to that current, present and future conversation about video games in China. This is going to be a really quick whip through the work that ACMI has been doing for some time in terms of our video games as part of our multi-art form screen institution. So we have been collecting and preserving video games for 20 years. This is actually our old digital preservation lab before the renewal. And our collection includes a range of different ephemera. We do have a little bit more than you, John, but it includes these beautiful objects like actual diaries from the making of Untitled Goose Game, amongst other things. So both physical objects as well as digital. We've been presenting major exhibitions for many years. This is Game On, which we presented in 2008. It's still touring as a major exhibition that looks at the history of video games. And then in 2011, the team created our own major blockbuster, Game Masters, which had a long touring life internationally. And at the time, the sort of auteurs of video games weren't within the common lexicon, I guess, or popularly understood. So this was the chance to really put a spotlight on these games creators. While the team were making Game Masters, they knew that there was another story to be told about players and the role that players could make. But in 2011, I guess it didn't. I guess the games that we now know, like Minecraft or so many where they are completely shaped by players, they weren't so prevalent. But I guess as part of the renewal, we have the Big Ant Studios Games Lab, so it puts I guess a regular rotation of Victorian, Australian, and ideally international video games that are part of our daily lives. It puts them in regular rotation. Unsurprisingly, it's one of the most popular parts of the story of a moving image. We've also made smaller video games exhibitions that have toured nationally. This was Code Breakers. It reached about 188,000 people through its tour. I think the exhibitions explored female creators behind leading Australian video games and what's distinct and impactful about those works. I do think perhaps, it's sort of going off on a tangent, but in terms of, I guess, the social issues that are contained within video games, putting a spotlight on women creators in video games also entailed us to create safety plans for our staff for some of the first time in terms of the online feedback that they would receive. It was around the time of Gamergate, so it's interesting to think through how games live in the world. Untitled Goose Honk, an Untitled Goose exhibition about the Melbourne-made video game Untitled Goose Game, was our most visited exhibition at ACMI, 120,000 people. What I think was so genius about what Jeannie Maxwell did in curating this exhibition is Jeannie didn't start with, this is a video game. They started with, what is the construction of a joke and what does it feel like to be the funny one in the room? So Charlie Chaplin slapstick reels were a big part of this exhibition, and it meant that it was very intergenerational, and Dan Golding's beautiful composition obviously supported that really nicely. I guess I've only been with ACMI for 2 years, and I have a very multi-art form background, but I think what is beautiful to understand and that I really take as a very lovely philosophy about video games in cultural institutions is video games come from communities. And I really liked an article that was published by the Magpie Group at Melbourne University alongside, it was about October last year, and it really noted that video games don't create communities, communities create video games. And I think that's a lovely kind of demonstration of this is Cult of the Lamb and this ritual that was presented as part of Melbourne International Games Week. But that kind of community engagement thinking has driven a lot of the programming that we've been doing across the museum for the last couple of years. So we've had, this is a Final Fantasy fan event that we did in partnership with Square Enix, where fans got to meet Yoshi P, who's the creative director, and do all sorts of other activities. But I guess what I love about video game fans is the notion of creating safe spaces for self-expression is very fundamental. And I think, to your point, John, museums have a very important role to play because we are ultimately not commercial spaces. And a lot of self-expression and kind of community cohesion happens in video game communities, but it is often really expensive. So I think museums and public institutions go a long way to leveling out and making different kinds of people who are all challenged by cost of living pressures welcome into this conversation. If you're not programming video games in your cultural institution, that's okay. It looks a lot like the kinds of things you already do. It looks like talks. This is the makers of Celeste, Maddie Thorsten, Noel Berry from Canada. They're just doing a talk about the process behind the creation of their amazing and complicated video game. It can look like industry discussions. This is a really wonderful annual event we do in partnership with Massive Monster, a local studio, about female and non-binary creators taking up space in the industry. This is a dating show that we did. A live dating show where people found love. This was specifically one for people who play video games. We've done adjacent, I guess, programming. Godzilla was a program we did for the 70th anniversary of the monster. But I guess fans of anime and fans of video games they talk to each other a little bit. These are different kinds of ways that we've embedded video games and play across the museum. We also share games in development as part of our Audience Lab program with RMIT. And this is a really nice thing that games are particularly well suited for, where members of the general public can come and give it a bash and kind of test out and give feedback and say what's working and not working to creatives directly. And when you think about all the work we must do as a cultural sector to demystify what it is that is involved in creative practice, the fact that you can generously stand there and say, yeah, I'm not sure about that, but what do you think? Does it make sense? I think that's a very courageous thing for young creatives or established creators to be doing. And it's something that is being taken on board. I think part of the I can't remember the National Theatre, I think, in the UK. There is a boardroom where you can kind of look, one of the ways that, correct me when I'm wrong, John, but one of the ways in which you can, they're refashioning their theatre is to be able to look down onto the rehearsal room and understand, people, making that process more visible to more people is important. Our education programs welcome about 100,000 kids a year. The kinds of conferences we run, the workshops and the games resources that are made available by the team obviously are so engaging to kids. You are welcome to have a look through Game Worlds this evening. We're open late, but if that isn't available, I thought I'd just play a quick video so you can get a sense of it.
Right, amazing. All right, thank you so much, both. John, do you have anything you'd like to add from your perspective? I know that you've just done a huge keynote, but do you have any thoughts before we dive into the discussion that you'd like
No.
to add? It's so interesting hearing all three of you speak, like, even though you all work with games, the cultural context and the geographical context of your work is so different. And so I wanted to kick off the discussion with a bit of a broader questions around what are some of the biggest challenges that you see in the work that you do, and particularly working with games as a medium that's only been around for 50 years. Emily, I know you just had the floor, so happy to jump to you in a game world's context to maybe kick us off. What's your view on that?
I think one of the challenges I'm thinking about a lot is there is a tension. There's a deep tension between the prevalence of people playing video games and the identities that they will afford themselves, and so your propensity to participate, even though you're a player, in cultural moments that are inside institutions is, I think that's difficult. And yeah, John, I'm keen to hear more about the research you referred to, because we'll have over 100,000 people attend this exhibition. It's not a small thing, but at the same time, the volume of people who are engaged in games, and then their cultural participation within a public cultural higher art kind of context, that sort of sits in a tension to me. And I feel that as cultural workers, we have to do something about that. We have to be more thoughtful or more generous in our invitations. I find that very motivating as a tension, but it's still very present. And so all the baggage associated with gamer will continue to show up as an issue for cultural institutions until we are ever more inviting, I guess, in how we bring people in.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, does that land with you, John, from your perspective as well?
It does, yeah. And I think this question of identity, and I'm not really the right person to speak about this. I wish Imogen Albiston was here, who worked with us on their research about this question of who is a gamer, because people don't want to have this title. Also, there's a lot of protection, people who don't want to allow someone to have this title, and there's a perception, if we're going into some of the negatives, I'll bring some levity afterwards, but you mentioned Gamergate, and this is a kind of ground zero for some of the toxic online political climate that we're in now. Okay, it's come from within video games, and it's and this is something that really, this is partly, again, why you need a cultural institution to hold the space. So what you're saying there about, people maybe don't, I think sometimes people might play a particular game, but then they don't see themselves in a wider context. And one of the attractions to having a museum is enabling that capacity for reflection, because particularly as games are so immersive, you actually maybe don't think too much about, what am I doing when I'm playing games, and how does this connect to other things? But on in terms of what we're doing, and some of it mirrors work that you're doing within a wider project, we're going to be hosting events, really focusing on particular communities of play. So you showed some cosplay things. I think there's being able to sort of frame that within a cultural context, I think is really, really valuable. The sort of fan communities. But in terms of who accesses culture, I do think video games provide a massive opportunity. So we have data from our city and our region and across the UK, and there's this challenge, people from who are not from middle-class backgrounds, so working-class people from marginalised backgrounds, there's a huge barrier to going to cultural stuff. You put the word museum over the door, and people can't really realize what that's like unless you've been on the other side of it. Like I remember growing up, and there was a theatre in my town, and wasn't the sort of thing, my parents would have never gone to a theatre. I didn't know if I was allowed to go in that building, and it looks terrifying. So breaking down that barrier is a massive challenge for cultural organizations. And there's lots of very good and also kind of well-meaning initiatives to try and break this stuff down. But what we've found in our data is our museum is attracting all of the people from our city who don't go to the other museums come to our space, and we know that because we're paid entry, we're an independent charity, and so we have the receipts, we can go to the postcodes, all of the neighborhoods that the other institutions don't have people visiting from, we do. So I think there's a way to short circuit that through presenting something that people actually care about, frankly. I used to work in the UK, the National Football Museum. So there's an incredible museum of football in the UK, in Manchester, but it's not like the Hall of Fame. It's not an industry initiative. It's actually a museum of social history. It's actually a museum of how this sport has influenced and, been an integral part of working class life in the UK. So I think there's ways that video games as a subject can break down these barriers, but it's not to be taken for granted. And that's why I put up at the beginning, video games are for everyone, because you have to say the quiet part loud sometimes, because there may be people who don't think that and don't agree with you.
Yeah, it's such an interesting tension between the medium as well and who gets to call themselves like a gamer and someone who plays games, but also games having such a different access point often, with people being able to access games in different ways, whether it's like historically to torrenting or emulation. So it's really interesting to think in that light of it being a younger medium as well, and culturally, geographically, there's such a big component to it as well. I'm keen to hear from you as well, Hugh, talking about games, how they're perceived, who can see themselves as a gamer in the context of your research in China in particular. How does this play out? Could you speak a little bit on that as well?
Yeah, no, it's quite different. It's very different sort of set of concerns. It's just things like Gamergate are sort of not really known that well in China, if at all. So that really was, in Western discourse, one of the most major kind of points in gaming culture in the last sort of 20 years. But when that was happening in the Anglosphere, in China, there was a celebration that after 15 years, video game consoles were no longer banned, which meant that you could legally buy a video game console in China, which had been in force since 2000. And Monument Valley tore through Chinese mobile sector, and everyone was playing it, and so many people who were working in large video game companies, Konami and Tencent and that kind of thing in China, left their jobs and went, I'm going to make a mobile game that's a work of art. So just seeing you show that there, I thought that is a really pivotal point, I would say, in Chinese gaming culture, from commercial to independent, that game alone. But with that question of like it's very difficult to work out how, when someone asks you something or you ask somebody something and they're like, look, what you've got to understand is, and then they end up sort of going like, so in 1830, and you're just like, oh no, how much context. But getting back to the video games ban, so a big thing about video games in China, probably the biggest hurdle I have to navigate is working not so much with museums, but working with the government, who is representative of the people who are informed by the media, who are very suspicious of and concerned about video games. So like a very virile discourse about video games as what gets called digital heroin or electronic opium. And that was very sort of like, very virulent in the 1990s and the 2000s, to the point where you had these sort of like video game addiction clinics where people would be sort of kids would be put into these sort of boot camps to break their video game addiction.
Yeah, right.
And it's really important to kind of brace this as well by saying that, like, saying electronic heroin in China is, and this is where we get back to 1830, because in 1830 you had an opium war between Britain and, like, there's a trade imbalance, there's all of this, Britain wants Chinese tea, but they don't have anything to trade it with, so they end up growing lots of opium and heroin in India and Afghanistan and essentially bringing it into the country. I'm not having a go at you. My family's from Bradford, which is just down the road from you. So, but
well, I'm Irish, so, you know.
there we go. But so the point is that 1830, 1840 moment, that really sparks this what is now called the century of humiliation in China, which sort of breaks with the rise of the Communist Party in sort of 1948, 1949, or them taking power. So to say something is electronic heroin says imported, civilizational corrupting drug. Essentially, like, it's a highly loaded term. So, and it's the government cracks down on it, but they do so at the behest of the of families, of parents who are informed by, you know, clicky media and that kind of thing. So that is a very big obstacle to the point of running a museum, what games you show, what games you can show, what games are published. For example, you know, following the end of the console ban, when mobile phone games really took off from the sort of early 2010s up until 2020. In 2018, there was a video game publication freeze, which means that, you know, being the biggest video game market in the world, there was probably, I don't know, anywhere between like 100 and 1,000 games that were being or attempting to be published every week. And the Chinese government just went, no more. Nobody's publishing any games. So no games were published for what ended up being, I think, 9 months. But during the whole time, nobody knew when it was going to end. And I visited Tencent at that time and sat down with some of the developers there and some of the managers who were just saying, we're losing billions of RMB every day. We don't know. We can't update anything. We're not quite sure what to do. So I guess it's important to say this from the point of view of, you know, all of this is framing and understanding that, like, a lot of people think of, like, you know, China as being sort of quite capitalist, which it is in these sort of special economic region areas where video games are produced. But it's a bridled capitalism, which we don't have, whereby the government, with the full support of the people, because they are also concerned about video games, will completely freeze the publication. And so working on researching, discussing, celebrating, exhibiting video games in that context has a different set of...
It would absolutely. And even thinking around it, I'm going to come back to you, John and Emily, in a moment, but thinking through things like audiences for games initiatives as well. How do you navigate that tension when you have an audience that, like, more broadly for the medium, there's so many people who have a different idea of what a game should be or what a person who plays games should look like. But when you're navigating that in a context of, like, people maybe holding certain negative connotations, what kind of impacts did you see in your work with cultural institutions or activities? How do people navigate that?
Well, there's some great work being done in China by the museums that I mentioned, but also by a woman called Filania Liu, who's in Beijing, and she runs an institute called the Homo Ludens Archive. And so they're just sort of archiving a lot of magazines, a lot of literature, a video games culture from the China in the 1980s and 1990s. And they're really just sort of like, the big institutions are starting to catch up now, and it's mostly video game companies going like, this is really important history, but there isn't a sort of, you know, national video game museum in the same way as, for example, what Britain enjoys or what we enjoy here in Australia. But a lot of what Felania does is that she will visit schools and she will visit galleries and museums, and she will provide literacy on what video games are, sort of targeted a little bit towards children, but also towards teachers and towards families, and just sort of trying to educate people on the nuances of video games, because the problem with video games is that particularly in China, so many of the video games that have been produced as part of China's digital Great Leap Forward. Like it's a sort of economic push through digital culture. But as part of that process, some of the more toxic games are the ones that get the most downloads and the most plays and that kind of thing, which are, of course, also the ones that the government is most concerned about. So what she does and what many other people are doing is trying to sort of say, you know, video games can be expressions of culture and of history and of family and of friendship and of all of these other things. You know, it's about all that video games are, all that they can be, homespun games, heartfelt games, all of this stuff that people are sort of less aware of because they just see their kids sort of doing this. And celebrate and just making people aware of that side of video game culture. So I do some of that work when I'm in China, but it's certainly, it's there are good people there doing that work already.
Yeah. I mean, games are. You just touched on the breadth of things that audiences see when they play games, and if you take that back into the practical work that museums do, like exhibitions, like Emily, I'm interested. What are some of the ways that you and the team practically use to, in game world, say, navigate that diversity and the idea that people might expect different things from the term games when they step into the exhibition space?
I mean, I guess we very explicitly embrace the fact that people have a wide variety of expectations and kind of, I guess, entry points. Across all exhibitions that we're making, we are interested in multiple modes of engagement. So, and I think it's especially important for when you are engaging with screen as a medium, because it's an evolving and fluid technology, and but it is also one that is abundant in people's lives, and they come to ACMI or they come to a video game museum or a film museum. They come with a high degree of knowledge, and you have to have quite a respectful relationship with their literacy, whether they know it or not. You know, they know that barrier is actually very low. I totally agree with you, John, that the sort of title of museum is some barrier, but the bar of entry, for opera or even theatre, for expensive and older art forms, is that much higher. I don't need to convince anyone that TV is a medium of the world that they exist in. So we have this much more porous and dialectical and exciting relationship with our visitors, and it puts you in a position of needing to be very alert to their expectations. So audience research drives so much of our decision making. For Game World specifically, we had a lovely advisory panel, which John and Jason were both part of, amongst a range of other people, and they gave us incredible advice and a lot of suggestions about the kinds of games that we should include. We also had our own lists of games that we wanted there. Recognizability was fundamental to getting people across that threshold. They needed to know that there were games in there that they were familiar with. But the best part of the exhibition is absolutely introducing people to games that they've never known. Some of the most popular sort of displays in Game Worlds are from games from local studios like 2 Point Interactive that aren't released yet. They're prototypes, but they're puzzle games, they're collaborative, they require intergenerational conversation to kind of work. The Sandpit collaborated with us. They're a local creative agency to create a Dungeons and Dragons interactive and to give people a tiny taste of what D&D is like. it was definitely the display we were nervous about because it requires performativity. It requires people to kind of step into storyteller mode, and it was right at the front, and we made a lot of bold choices, about it being very spotlit and the first thing that you would see. And so I guess, it set up from the beginning, this will be an exhibition when you're doing things, which is cool, but it was also like, will they be shy and not want to do things? Thankfully, people aren't shy and they get right in, and we have amazing visitor experience staff who kind of step into that space as well if they need to. But it has been incredibly, not validating, but heartening to see, that you put the right conditions for people to feel confident to play, and they absolutely will, and they will play alongside strangers, and they will play along things that they don't know. And those are the kinds of challenges that I think, certainly at ACMI we take incredibly seriously. The seriousness of play, I guess, and how important it is for adults, and how important proximity to strangers is, and people who you don't know, and doing unfamiliar things with people that with communities that you wouldn't interface with if you were in your very small WhatsApp chat, every day. So, all of these are all the reasons I really like what we do, and I find it really, really fun.
Yeah, that's so lovely, like creating that invitation to bring people into the worlds of games is so lovely to see. I mean, how does that land with you, John? I know you, in your presentation, you spoke about taking a lens on people rather than projects. Do you have anything that you want to add from your perspective?
I'd probably come to that, but just in terms of Hugh's sort of picture that you painted there of China, first of all, if I have a midlife crisis and I start a band, it'll be called Electronic Opium. But one of the things I find really interesting about this subject is video games are in this space where they're like the worst thing in the world, but they're also so trivial they're not even worth consideration. They're toys. And I'm not a cheerleader for video games. I've always pursued, I'm interested in anything that people are obsessed with. If people are really getting into a thing, I want to sort of understand what's going on at a human level, and people are spending a lot of time in video games, and they're engaging with this subject. But we were talking before about challenges, and just before we go, I just want to say something we haven't really talked about in this discussion is the video games industry itself. Because it's a young medium, and things haven't sort of perhaps matured in certain ways in terms of standards of working practices. We talked a lot about archiving, but just even how video games, the people making it and the people making decisions in that industry, what they think about this. And also, just the last thing on China, I suppose, is Tencent, I know now, have bought dozens of UK game studios. So
same in this part of the world.
Right, yeah. I mean,
it's really expanded.
Sumo Digital in Sheffield has 1,000 people in the workforce. Tencent bought Sumo Digital, I think, for more than £1 billion recently. And so I think there's just so much dynamism of what's going on. It's bad, it's good, it's huge, it's tiny boutique things. That's why it's just such a rich subject matter.
Yeah, and I'm interested. I know we've got about 13 minutes left, which has flown past. So if you haven't submitted any questions, please jump on that whenever you're ready. But talking about how the industry is still forming, what does that mean in your view and the work that you do in terms of preservation? And like you touched on, getting folks to keep their materials and document what they're doing. And particularly, I'll jump over to you, Hugh, in the context of China, where that dialogue is very different. What does it mean to advocate for preserving materials in a very different geographical context?
Yeah, it's quite interesting actually, because at one level, China, when we talk about video games, we talk about them in a strange way in the present, in terms of I'm a game studies scholar. I was at a game studies conference in Australia yesterday in Brisbane, and so much of the discussion is around platforms and around video games. Usually kind of people sort of default to the US in terms of, you know, like people will talk about games which end up being from the US. But when you look at sort of where video games are largely produced and largely played, sort of the US is quite marginal, as is the rest of us. So video games culture is quite weird in that there's a hole around China, which is the area which is most understudied, but where most of the activity is happening. And to tell people that, you know, and it's not to say that these other areas should not be studied. In fact, I think, you know, what a great thing there when we study a culture. We begin at the margins and then work our way in. Imagine if everything was like that. But so much work needs to be done in terms of studying video game cultures and history in China. I guess the other thing is that with that government tension is that, like, all video games are kind of geopolitically inflected. So with American video games, you've got this, everything's always like first video game, space war, and so many video games are war, first-person shooter. That's the sort of narrative and mechanic inflection of American video games broadly. So, you know, very sort of like, you know, we are a scary global power and very individualistic. So Japan is like, you know, dun, 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 dun. It's cute, it's friendly, forget about Second World War, like we're really nice now, it's cute, there's nothing to worry about, side-scrolling, just jumping and having fun. Chinese video game culture is asserting itself as Chinese civilization. And, you know, you think about Black Myth Wukong, which is one of the first really governmentally celebrated games in China, because it does so much heavy lifting in terms of China's cultural confidence and exporting overseas and that kind of thing. And the point that I'm getting to here is that we're looking at video games and putting them in museums, but for China and for the Chinese government, there's a particular sort of understanding of video games as museums, as like when you put Chinese civilizational culture and cosmology in a game, it is preserving culture and it's sharing it with people. So there's really big sort of, you know, restrictions and concerns about how video games themselves should be sort of like curated as archives of information. So again, it's sort of differently inflected.
Yeah, and I guess more broadly, it can be so difficult for institutions to make a call on what to keep. There's things like survivorship bias, which in every discipline is a problem. So I'm interested, Emily and John, about your perspectives on that as well. Maybe I'll come to you first, Emily, and then come back to you, John. On the on the challenges, particularly with preservation in video games, if you're navigating things like survivorship bias basically in real time, because it's a much younger medium, what are some of the things that you can see museums do in that space now to tackle that?
Our head of collections, Sarah Caldwell, has like, I know it sounds really dry, but our policy is really robust now, and I think it is about putting it down on paper and having a shared understanding of what cultural value is at this time, defined by the organisation's values in this way. Because yes, there is an infinite amount of things that you could be doing at all points, but you actually do have finite resources. So yeah, it's as dry as that. We have a really robust collections policy now, and it's really rigorously kind of examined by a range of people so it's not coming down to one person's subjectivity or networks, I guess. And I think that's appropriate. We're a state government owned by taxpayers, so
I love that as a note to end on
Sorry.
policy. No, that's great. I love it. What about you, John? What's your perspective on it?
In terms of what ends up in museums and what ends up in the canon, I think it's really important to sort of see this in quite a wide picture, because Hugh, you mentioned that people may know about this video games crash in the 1980s. A lot of money went out of video games, but What's less talked about is after that, that created a kind of higher risk perception of publishing video games. So the sort of demographic that video games were targeted towards became narrower. So from that kind of period of the late 80s, 90s, etc., video games are being marketed principally at a stereotyped idea of what a young boy might want. So the subjects become narrower, the marketing becomes narrower, and we're paying the price now, decades of essentially indoctrination, that, particular idea of who can play games. In our museum, we're tiny, but what we try to do is present things. For instance, we have the Magnavox Odyssey. It's one of the original video game consoles that you could buy. It was actually created by a Jewish guy in America. He left Germany to build a new life. And but that console, when that was marketed in 1972, so we could just have the console there, but we actually have the packaging as well. And on the packaging, it shows there's a young boy playing the game, but then there's a picture of a young girl playing the game, and there's a family playing the game. And it's actually the console, you don't just plug it in and it's not just a screen. You actually had to use physical material to make the thing work, which I could explain, but time. But what I'm saying is this was a very hybrid thing. It was intended for lots of people to make what they were going to make of it. It was a dialogue. And I think before we even start collecting, it's like, who has been excluded before these things have even been made?
Totally.
And that would be my question.
Yeah.
I think that's a wonderful note to end on before we jump to questions. Please join me in.
I just want to comment on it because I think what you're highlighting, John, is that because it is, and just there's a deep relationship between what we're doing in a cultural institution for video games and what the industry is doing, and it's because it's young, it's even more connected or alert to each other because of that dynamism that you spoke to before.
A tiny example of that. We collected. Somebody gave us something called PC Gamer, a magazine. They gave us 100 editions of this between 2000 and 2010, or more than that, maybe 500 editions or something. 98% of the hero image characters on the cover of this magazine are men, male protagonists.
Yep.
So there's a sort of mega who's missing from the conversation here piece, just in that. But as a museum, like I say, we're not just cheerleaders. We have an opportunity to sort of
take a position,
share that and kind of go, what was going on here, guys? And it is guys.
Yeah.
This is a bit weird. And we can have the conversation, and we can do better going forward.
Yeah.
We can care for the future of video games.
Yeah. It's so interesting because it reminds me of something you were saying yesterday where you were saying if Tetris would come out today, would we still look at it as this groundbreaking game, or would we look at it as like a hyper-casual mobile title?
Well, Tetris is canon. It's like people think of Tetris as one of the great video games. But now if someone plays Candy Crush, they're often not thought of as a proper gamer. And you wonder if Tetris came out now, would it be like, oh, that's just one of those that's not really a game.
Yeah.
So I think the conception of what can be a game, who can be a gamer, whose story is included, all of that has to be in the mix for a cultural institution anyway.
Definitely.
Yeah, that's hugely important. I think we have 3 minutes left, so I'm just going to grab the magical iPad off the side of the stage and then come back with questions. But while I'm grabbing it to our panelists, I'm giving like an Aaron Sorkin walkthrough of the space, I feel like. I also just wanted to be very cognizant of the fact that some folks might not be super familiar with games. Is there a piece of media or an exhibition that you would recommend someone read or engage with that really shaped you and that you think would be a good starting point for them?
Contemporary games, I would still go to Monument Valley. I just think if you're not familiar with games and you're not familiar with games now, just download it on your phone, play with it for 5 minutes, and it's a great way in. Also, I'm not being sponsored for this, but go to Game World, and it can do much better than I can do.
Amazing. What about you, Hugh and Emily? Any thoughts?
There's a graphic novel called Game-ish that is a very legible way to kind of just find all your touch points in terms of games history. I would say it's, I enjoyed that with my 10-year-old, so, and it's got all sorts of commentary, I guess, on what both happened and also what we think about that. And it's got a really good kind of criticality, and we sell it in the Hackney shop.
Cool. What about you, Hugh? Any thoughts on that?
Oh God, it's so hard. In terms of game studies, there's a really interesting book from last year or maybe the year before called Repairing Play by an American guy called Aaron Trammell. And he's an African-American game theorist, play theorist, scholar, kind of, which is sort of how I describe myself, I don't know, yeah. But he's written a brilliant book which is, I'm going to say, like 120 pages, and it's highly readable. You don't need to be a game scholar to get through it. And he really talks about some of the issues that you've brought up around, like, who gets to play and how do we play. And he speaks a lot about the Black American experience of play, and does a lot of stuff which I've tried to do really kind of awkwardly and inelegantly before, in highlighting some of these things, like recognizing that when a cat kills a mouse, it plays with the mouse. And that, like, when you saw the photos of Abu Ghraib in America, those people were playing, and he has a whole section on torture as play, which is really important from the point of view of just disassembling this heroics of play as being inherently good. I mean, play is great. It's the only language we share with animals, but at the same time, it's not inherently good. So I just want to say that one. The other one is...
Technology isn't neutral either.
Exactly. All of those things. And, there are structures around this stuff. And the other one is, it's such a weird one to say, but like, in terms of these things, and just to understand a different cosmology and a different way in which not just games, but technology is developing, I would say to anyone, like, just visit China to see a different way in which technology and video games and governance and all of these things are being understood for all of its, all the great ways in which it's happening and all the not great ways in which it's happening. It does one thing, which is that it opens up a horizon of alternative. You're like, oh, okay, this can actually all be done differently, which I think a really important thing at the moment, where we see our kind of horizons really narrowing and rushing towards us, to see that, there are differences.
Yeah. Do we have time for a couple of questions, by the way? Can we... I'm going to take that as a yes.
We've got, 24 seconds for a question?
Oh,
no, sorry.
Because interestingly, there is a question here that says, do you discuss the negative aspects of the video game industry in your museums, like the spread of game addiction, especially among younger generation? Anyone that has thoughts on that?
I think we've sort of spoken to that. But
I don't mind saying something about it, though. First of all, it was recently written that the paper that cites game addiction as a thing is not legitimate research, and that's not to say I don't think that people can spend too much time playing games and that games can have addictive properties, but the actual research wasn't credible. But in our museum, we see it as really important to stage conversations and to sort of say, this is an important part of our lives, it's happening, so let's try and own it. One of the things I'd love for us to do more would be intergenerationally doing that. We presented the game Fortnite, for instance. We did a whole load of work around the controls that you can implement, because you wouldn't just let your child go to a park and talk to random people, but in a game world that can happen in a virtual sense. So we need that learning that, here's how you can be safe in the online environment.
No, that's a very good note to end on, and I think that's all we have time for, because the timer is flashing angry red at us. But thank you so much, everyone, for listening, and thank you so much to our panelists as well.